how can we have a functional society without knowing who people are? This question is at the core of debates around policing, documentation, national identity and immigration, and contributes heavily to the historic reality of stereotype and prejudice found across human civilization. We're still relying on racial, physical or ethnic profiling today to create in-groups and out-groups. And yet, in fantasy worlds, the existence of shapeshifters and shape-changers destabilizes all of that, and might just have massive, massive implications on how identity itself is constructed, perceived, and expressed in a society. And I think that we're not taking these considerations into account enough when we're world building these fantasy world filled with shape-changing creatures. So, let's get into it. First, we're going to look at the impact on personal identity. Because transforming into a different physical entity is going to change how people perceive themselves. For shapeshifters, it seems reasonable that their identity may not be fully or always human. A werewolf, for example, may perceive themselves as two distinct entities, not wanting to mix the two, muddy the water, or have any of the implications of that. They may see themselves as the human that they are, and this cursed werewolf form, which they also are, but not at the same time. But for beings that can shift at will, we're likely to see greater integration of these two forms, these two identities, into one person, as it were. Perhaps they adopt traits and behaviours that work across both forms. Or there is some category slippage, even when they're in one form, as parts of their other self bleed into their characterisation and personality. This all may seem fairly obvious, but it is worth teasing it out just a little bit further. Because both of these ways of engaging with personhood jar quite significantly with the modern Western concept of the individual self. I've mentioned it before in some of my videos, but I think that fantasy worlds could do very well from having a greater diversity of the kinds of identity on display. Specifically, fantasy worlds are more likely to have more individual persons than we see in our worlds. A individual sense of personhood is one that puts community at the core of identity, where a person is seen as a collection of their relationships and their social experiences, more so than as an independent individual agent making their way through the world, formed of the same singular mind and body. Now, I wouldn't argue that one mind occupying two different forms is necessarily a form of individual personhood, but it is certainly a novel kind of identity that is just not seen in our world outside of folk magic and folk religion and fiction. The specific identity of any single werewolf is likely to depend on multiple factors, but perceiving themselves as a cursed man, a werewolf in disguise as a man, or even as some sort of split Jekyll and Hyde situation, they're all going to have massive impacts on how that creature interacts socially as a being. It'll impact everything from the way they lead their social life to whether they're willing to seek help from men or simply from other werewolves, and even the extent to which dysmorphia, shame, or self-loathing impact their psyche. Syncretic embodiment, the fusion of a shapeshifter's forms into one self, one personality, would offer fairly unique insights on both of the social environments of their two forms. And it's not just social either. Certain forms of perception are just different across different creatures. Spatial reasoning and awareness may be enhanced by seeing the world through different eyes, literally. And shapeshifters with different sensory organs in their other forms may be invaluable in tracking as lookouts, detecting magical interference in search and rescue, or even in the production of art. Perceiving the world through the eyes of a fly, or a rabbit, some prey animal, may have a truly revolutionary effect on perspective as it's displayed in art, or even the methods of artistic expression themselves. But then there's also shape-changing. For me, there's a distinction between shape-shifting and shape-changing, which I feel is important and intuitive, and often really underexplored, if at all explored, in fantasy media. A shapeshifter is one who changes their fundamental platonic form into that of another creature, like a man turning into a badger. A shape changer, on the other hand, can change their self into a variety of different presentations while maintaining the original platonic form of their body. Like someone changing from a male presentation to a female presentation, or a human to an elf. That sort of thing. Think the difference between Beast Boy and Ben 10, who change into platonic ideals of their chosen creatures, be they beasts or aliens. And Mystique, who in some adaptations is limited to taking on other humanoid forms, but can change specific features around to not just be generic woman or generic man, but more specific. Why is this important? Well, shape-shifting is far less complicated when it comes to personal identity, because all it does is allow a transition from a presumably social human form into a different creature's form, usually an animal. Yes, we'd likely see some identity slippage between these two forms, but each of their shape-shifted forms has a different social role to play in its specific species' society. Wolf form, predator in the wilds. Man form, participant in society. Werewolf form, monster. For shape changers, on the other hand, their form shifting takes them between different parts of the web of human or humanoid social interaction. And they find different points on that web depending on the form they are taking at that moment, which is moving within the broad social web as opposed to changing the paradigm. This likely leads to far more identity confusion, dysphoria, and form slippage than a shapeshifter who can at least categorize their forms by their broad biological purpose as a creature. Hunt, cooperate, rampage. In the shape changer, we cut right to a very significant question for shape-shifting more generally. Does the ability to change form necessarily imply a fluid personal identity? We can, I feel, more interestingly explore this with shape changers than shapeshifters because, frankly, the human social world is the most complex social dynamic that we have at our disposal to study. And the performance of humanness itself is wrapped up in so many intersectional questions of race, gender, ability, and culture. We could simply say that each shape changer is an individual person, which is the approach I've seen most commonly in fantasy media. In this conception, the shape changer has one base form, like Mystique's Blue Lady form, or D&D's Doppelganger's gangly alien form. And the identity and presentation of this basic form is taken as the singular identity in all of the creature's forms. The rest are just masks or pretenses or shapes that they're wearing temporarily before they eventually have to revert back to their basic identity. For example, Mystique is consistently referred to as female, even when she is portraying masculine features, as long as people are able to see through their deception. And doppelgangers have names and personality traits which persist through all of the forms they take, and generally they're perceived as only being able to take forms of creatures that they've already seen. There's no kind of creativity in the form making there. It's all about deception and masking. I mean, the closest we ever get in this type of story to category slippage is when a shape changer gets lost in a role, like a modern-day method actor. This, I feel, is not really a genuine attempt to engage with the problem of shape changing on its own terms. We're just too locked in to individual identity as our one method of perceiving identity to explore the vast array of implications that being able to change your shape within a humanoid experience will likely lead to. There is just this broad spectrum of fluidity that does open up as an option when discussing this kind of character. Now, I'm not saying that fluidity is a necessity of a shape-changing character, but that it is likely to be far, far more prevalent in such creatures than we make it seem in our fantasy worlds. When we want to kind of simplify down identities to, oh no, that's Mystique. Just, she looks like a man now, right? I believe it's more interesting if we give most of our shapechangers their own individual identities. To use another pop culture example, we should be more looking at kind of James McAvoy in Split, except without the focus on an original identity in Kevin. Now, unlike dissociative identity disorder, which the film is trying to riff off, a shapechanger with individual sense of personhood would likely view their alter egos as a broad collection of selves who operate as a community or family to achieve their group's common goal. It's not the case that Steve wants to go off and do a bunch of crimes and Gina wants to sit at home and do some weaving. That's not what we're dealing with here. It's not different individuals. It is a individual collection of different senses of self that come together in a collective to make meaning as a group. It's not like they're different people, because fundamentally these beings are going to be sharing one mind and one body, as we would perceive it philosophically at least. It's more of a sense that the collective wants and skills and faces on display are going to be used as a collective, as a family unit or a collaborative set of individuals to form the identity that, or to bolster the identity that the shapechanger has. As these identities in a shapechanger are going to be developed by the central creature as methods, as ways to act in a social world. Now, you may end up with shapechangers favouring certain faces, or going mad and splintering into a whole bunch of different psyches, but with a sense of responsibility to the myriad different selves that make up a self in the individual mindset. A shapechanger would probably be a deeply empathetic individual, working best in societies with honour systems or strong familial expectations, and they may really even struggle in systems which value individualism and capitalism, as selfish competition is quite hard to fathom intuitively when your entire existence is about achieving the needs of the broad swath of people that constitute you. But now I've given my thoughts on the impacts of shapechanging on personal identity, I think let's move to how society might respond to the reality of shapechangers. Because the very possibility that you might be having a chat with someone who was someone else 30 seconds ago is gonna shake things up, really. First and foremost, assuming that shapechangers form some part of society, or are just known to exist in the world, we'd likely see people be more careful, not just in speech, but in actions as well. The possibility of your friend being a villain, or a spy, or a shapechanger in disguise is going to affect how you interact with them. It's a persistent conspiratorial fear in a world that knows that shapechangers exist, no matter how common such events may actually turn out to be. Equally, especially in worlds with animalian shapeshifters, one would also need to pay attention and perhaps behave more furtively at all times, just in case the spider in the corner is some shape-shifted eavesdropper. Again, no matter how unrealistic these concerns, the possibility of their existence in such a world will shape social behaviour. Some societies may be militaristically anti-animal, forcing all creatures to be outside of the home to create a private space, away from any potential shapeshifters. No pets, just working animals, regarded with healthy distrust. And yet other societies may adopt ritual behaviours on seeing animals. Perhaps spotting a wolf in the woods requires you to perform the ritual act of leaving some meat as a gift for the creature, just in case. Perhaps if a bird nests on your roof, it is custom that whenever you leave that house, you must greet it warmly, morning, noon, and night. Rituals around people to safeguard against shape changes may be more complex still. Social behaviour generally, greeting someone, could begin with a confirmatory ritual. Probably not a simple one like, "You're right," but a more complex, perhaps even individualised greeting depending on the friendship you have with a person or a specific social reference that you would both understand. Just to confirm that they're who they say they are, even if that's subconscious or a completely non-conscious thing that's just baked into tradition nowadays, in a time that's less paranoid about these sorts of things. I mean, this is likely to shift and change over time to have more and more elaborate, more showy and more kind of fun greeting rituals take place. Like you get a specific kind of hug from each person you greet depending on your relationship with them and what you've agreed before. Perhaps even subconsciously agreed on becoming friends. Strange callback nicknames or specific highly ritualised handshakes, for example. And I will say all of these things, from ritualised handshakes to furtively glancing around just to make sure there's nobody eavesdropping even though you're in an enclosed room, to greeting birds when you see them out and about. These are all ritualised behaviours that are still common today in the modern Western world. And many of them are so integrated into our normal ways of being that we kind of forget that they're there. But what if shapeshifters or changers aren't to be feared? What if they're an integrated part of society? Well, you would start to see these confirmatory rituals built into speech and action even more. English is a wonderful language in many ways, and awful in many others. But it is very, very good at addressing people in a non-committal way. The fact that you and they can be both singular and plural is so very helpful indeed, especially in worlds where individual seeming people may in fact have multiple identities and want to be addressed plurally, like we discussed earlier. If your world languages don't have this feature, they may well develop it in time. To address the problem of the identity question of shape changes, generally, because you're not entirely sure who, what they are, or whether their identity is individual or individual, whether they see themselves as multiple persons forming the self or not. Equally, it may become common practice to ask, or at least hint towards needing to know, people's pronouns and species in a diverse fantasy world, or to develop neutral, inoffensive linguistic forms, so not addressing people as it. This would probably smooth out some of the problems of addressing people with fluid identities, as well as the problems inherent to having identifying features across multiple different kinds of species. We can't expect all the people of our fantasy worlds to be able to tell the difference between the genders of elf, for example. But what we can expect is that there's going to be linguistic or social structures in place in which you can ask or be expected to be told in a non-invasive, non-offensive fashion, or for greetings to include such information, either through subtle inflection, word choice, endings, or other signifiers, or for a non-committal neutral voice to dominate interactions between strangers, like a simplified, reserved form of the broader language, spoken usually at formal occasions and in among company where you don't know who you're talking to. I feel like this is very, very likely to be the case in most fantasy worlds, because unlike in our world, where the worst thing you're going to get for misidentifying a dog's gender or breed is a correction from their owner, in fantasy worlds with multiple sapient species with different identifying characteristics, the worst you can do is probably fail to sign a treaty, cause such great offence that you're going to spark a war. All of this matters doubly when you're dealing with a shape changer, or even a shapeshifter, like a werewolf. You don't want to start a war with the werewolves by mistakenly calling their leader a bitch. But I think the key question remaining is, what happens if shapeshifters or shape changers just aren't accepted at all into any society? In that case, such beings must be policed and identified. How do you ID a creature that can shift its form, size, and even the look of its face? Even modern methods like biometrics and DNA might fail to identify a shape-changer. Although two-factor authentication might work if they're impersonating someone specifically. Which brings us to today's sponsor. No, I'm kidding. I only take sponsorships for products and services that I'm personally interested in, and feel fair suggesting that you guys should actually spend money on. If that is you, by the way, do reach out. I do have my contact email in the description. In any case, how to formally identify or document a shape changer in a permanent fashion. You could chip them, I suppose, either with physical tags or even a magical signature, perhaps. But that system requires you to proactively find shapeshifters and shape changers, and to have a system that works multinationally to solve for issues in immigration and things of that description. Alternatively, we'd take the Harry Potter approach and have any shape-shifting person register with a central authority. But again, you've got enforcement issues on an international stage, and there's an issue with voluntary participation in one of these programs, in that not everyone will want that. Will want to be documented and have their file on record. I will say these issues are more prevalent the closer you get to modern technology and modern senses of ethics, except when enforcing laws against criminal behaviour. Then they're kind of universal wherever you are, fantasy world or modern world. That's the real breaking point here though, because evidence or even witness-based justice just fundamentally falls apart when it wasn't me, it was someone perfectly disguised as me. Becomes potentially a valid defence. To safeguard any hope of a fair trial in a system like this, you'd either need truth-telling magic, or to be absolutely positively certain that no shapeshifter could ever be an excuse, or to not care too much if just a few innocent people are found guilty. There are some classic confirmatory tests for shape changes across fiction, such as an aversion to silver, or the classic witch-finding method of the ducking stool, where a being suspected of supernatural gifts is exposed to a situation where they must use their gifts or die. The theory is that witches would choose the former. Personally, I would not expect most societies in any fantasy world to come up with like a watertight identifying method of determining whether there was shape-shifting or shape-changing influence in any particular criminal case. I think they're rather going to take the hit of condemning an innocent on the rare occasions that happens. And or they're going to make shape-shifting or shape-changing powers illegal and perhaps punishable by execution. I would imagine that forcing out tests like the ducking stool would develop as well. Perhaps mechanical traps with lead or silver-lined plates to squish any suspected shape changer into a position where they're forced to transform into their other form, such as getting a bear and squeezing it into a roughly humanoid shape, or putting a humanoid person in a rapidly shrinking cage with bars wide enough for any other creature than a human, smaller than a human, to feasibly escape. For shape changes, this wouldn't necessarily work. One method might be to try and induce some sort of altered state through various substances and hope that this allows them to loosen up and perhaps reveal their true form or another form. These may work if you've actually captured a shapeshifter or shape changer, but that won't always be the case. And it's this issue that I think is perhaps the biggest social impact of shape-changing powers. There's always an excuse. Or an explanation. Neighbours been acting weird? They've been replaced by a shape-changing doppelganger. Guards can't find a sneaky serial killer? Well, there's a murderous shape-changer on the loose, isn't there? The only person near the scene of the crime is a young child? Barely capable of holding themselves up, not holding a knife and stabbing someone in the neck. Well, what if that young child is actually a shape changer in disguise? Best be safe, eh? In a world where identity is not assured, where individuality is not a protection, and where you can't trust any beast just in case, we wouldn't just see linguistic formulae to identify each other, or silver pieces as a common currency, just to press into the palm of someone to make sure they're not some shape-changing creature. We see suspicions or feuds become fertile ground for accusations and persecutions, and full-blown witch hunts, especially if shape-changing is made illegal, unless you've got some way to tell who's who and who's lying. But that's all we have time for today. There is more to say about the concept of fluidity, identity fluidity, and the transformation of people across various protected characteristics, but I'm going to leave that one alone for now. I hope someone does tackle it in the future who has more of that personal experience than me, because I think this is a really, really fertile topic. The allegory of the shape changer, the shapeshifter, or shape changing itself has often been linked to trans identities and intersectional identity more broadly. And so I think it is really important to have that discussion. And if no one else does it in the next year or so, well, I'll have to tackle that with a lot of caveats up front. But there is so much interesting stuff we can do with the concept of a shapeshifter or a shape changer. And how much that affects society is really up to how much you're willing to let that run. How much of these ideas you're willing to let percolate, and how many more you have to integrate this fascinating extra facet of identity into fantasy. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeonmaster. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.